Nathaniel Cross slid my access badge across the conference table with 2 fingers, like it was something he didn't want to catch. "Go ahead and leave it," he said. "We've determined your role is non-essential." The insult was clinical, sterilized by corporate language, and a slide deck glowing behind him, Operational Optimization Initiative, bolded in blue. My name sat under a bullet point labeled Cost Reduction Infrastructure Overhead. I've never been so surprised to see my name appear. But I have to accept reality. Just like the reality that it's snowing heavily outside, blanketing the hills in white. I wonder what the temperature is where you live, and if you're still sitting here listening to my story. Please tell me your lucky number. To warm my heart a little, 21 years at the company, principal infrastructure architect, I built the integration layer that stitched together 17 legacy systems and 3 newer platforms that never quite trusted each other. I handled outages no one ever heard about because I fixed them before sunrise. I kept uptime so steady that executives forgot it required a human being. Nathan preferred to call it automation. "We've invested in AI monitoring," he continued, folding his hands like he'd just solved climate change. "The system runs itself now." I kept my expression neutral. Humiliation is loud inside your chest, but it doesn't have to show on your face. "Did you review the dependency map?" I asked. He smiled thin, dismissive. "We're not relying on tribal knowledge anymore." Tribal knowledge? That's what he called 2 decades of documented routing logic, failover contingencies, and the quiet patches that kept revenue flowing. They gave me time to transition documentation. I handed over everything. No locked accounts, no deleted scripts, no sabotage, just diagrams, notes, and a warning no one asked to hear twice. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard Nathan tell the room, "Watch, nothing's going to happen." Earlier that morning, they had modified a routing flag to simplify architecture. I didn't argue. My phone buzzed before I reached the elevator. A message from one of the engineers I trained years ago. Why did they touch the failover layer? What just happened was only the beginning. The next part of the story contains some fictional elements and uses AI to clarify the message and enhance the emotional experience. If you empathize, I greatly appreciate it. If not, I hope you have a peaceful evening and a good night's sleep. The next morning, Nathan unveiled what he called the future. He replaced me with a discount consulting firm that promised agile transformation, an AI monitoring platform marketed as self-healing, and a DevOps engineer barely old enough to rent a car who had never handled a multi-layer migration in production. During the town hall, Nathan stood under bright stage lights and announced, "We're eliminating knowledge silos." I almost admired the theater of it. I remembered sleeping on a folding chair outside the data center when corrupted transactions threatened payroll. I remembered a merger that nearly collapsed because 2 databases refused to reconcile customer IDs. I wrote a contingency manual over 100 pages long, outlining every dependency and failure scenario. No one had opened it in years. Now they were simplifying architecture to prove the system could run itself. They adjusted configuration flags and streamlined routing tables. There was no explosion, no dramatic shutdown, just a subtle slowdown. The transaction queue began to back up like traffic on a narrow bridge. The dashboard shifted from calm green to cautious yellow. Nathan glanced at the screen and waved it off. "Minor latency," he said, smiling for the room. Then the alerts deepened. Yellow hardened into red. Payment requests stopped responding. Customer sessions began timing out. There was still no noise, just the unmistakable sound of infrastructure proving it never ran itself. By early afternoon, the slowdown stopped pretending to be minor. One module lagged behind the others, just a few seconds at first. Then, inventory reconciliation began falling out of sync with billing. The API handling order confirmations started timing out, and those delays quietly bled into logistics. Trucks were queued without updated manifests. Warehouse scanners showed pending transactions that had already cleared, or hadn't, on the client dashboard. Account balances flickered and recalculated in ways that made no mathematical sense. Nothing exploded. Nothing caught fire. It was worse than that. It was quiet, from my kitchen table. I logged into a public-facing status page and watched the latency graphs climb. Each spike was small enough to dismiss in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern I recognized instantly: cascading dependency conflict inside the building. I knew what was happening. Someone would have suggested a rollback. Nathan did. The problem was that in their effort to simplify architecture, they had overwritten the version control history for the routing layer. The incremental backups that preserved configuration states had been merged and compressed to reduce redundancy. You cannot roll back to a state you no longer have. One of the engineers I trained years ago sent me a short message. Karis never removed that layer for a reason. He was right. I had kept that failover bridge in place because two legacy systems reconciled differently under load. It wasn't elegant. It was necessary. My phone rang. Nathan's name flashed across the screen. I let it ring. I had no credentials left, no formal responsibility, and no obligation to rescue decisions I had explicitly warned against. Silent chaos continued its careful spread. Then another notification arrived, this one forwarded by a former colleague in account management. Our largest client had issued a formal notice requesting immediate clarification regarding infrastructure instability impacting transaction integrity. That wasn't latency anymore. That was exposure. Nathan called again. And this time I answered. His voice had lost the polished calm from the town hall. "We need context," he said, clipped and tight, as if the word itself might fix what was unraveling. I let a second pass before responding. The system doesn't run itself. Silence stretched between us. In the background, I could hear overlapping voices, the low hum of a war room forming. He exhaled sharply. "We're seeing cascading failures across modules. Payment processing is unstable. We just need clarification on the routing logic. Clarification, not accountability, not responsibility. You removed a dependency bridge," I said evenly, "and you modified failover behavior without validating cross-system reconciliation under load." Another pause. He didn't argue this time. "Fine," he said. "We need you back. Immediately. Emergency consulting." There it was. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Send the contract through legal. He hesitated, as if surprised I wasn't rushing to save him. "Karis, this is urgent. I'm aware." While we spoke, downtime continued accumulating in quiet increments. Each stalled transaction carried a cost. Refund queues were growing. Customer service wait times were doubling. Social media complaints had begun to spike. The longer the instability persisted, the more expensive the lesson became. By then, the board had stepped in. I received a forwarded message from a director I trusted. The question circulating the executive thread was simple and lethal. Why was the lead infrastructure architect terminated before structural configuration changes were approved? Nathan would have to answer that. Minutes later, another internal update surfaced. The rapid audit of recent changes had uncovered something more troubling than a misconfigured flag. During the latest optimization, the incremental backup layer preserving prior routing states had been removed to streamline storage. There would be no simple rollback, and for the first time that day, the power in the room was no longer loud. It was quiet, and it was mine. If you agree that I was right to insist everything go through legal, instead of rushing back to quietly fix their mistake, leave a 1 in the comments, because when you speak up, you remind people that accountability matters. By the end of the day, the tone shifted from panic to investigation. The board ordered an internal review, and for the first time since my badge hit the table, the conversation moved from speculation to documentation. I wasn't in the building, but I had allies who understood what was unfolding. Screenshots began to reach me, threads, attachments, excerpts pulled from archived folders no one had opened in years. They found 3 emails I had sent over the past 18 months warning about dependency conflicts between the legacy billing engine and the newer orchestration layer. Each message outlined the same risk if the routing bridge was altered without staged validation. Cross-system reconciliation would fail under load. They found 2 formal upgrade proposals I had submitted, requesting controlled refactoring of the failover structure. Both were declined. And then they uncovered the memo. In plain language, I had written that modifying the routing configuration without preserving the incremental backup layer could trigger cross-system inconsistency and compromise transaction integrity. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. Nathan's response was attached below it. Too cautious. We need agility. Agility. That word again, used like a permission slip. When questioned, he attempted to redirect the narrative. He cited legacy complexity, implied that outdated architecture was the real problem, suggested that no one could have predicted this level of instability. It might have worked if the audit logs didn't exist. They did. The logs showed that he personally approved the configuration change request. His digital signature was stamped on the revision that removed the incremental backup layer. The timeline was clean, chronological, undeniable. Silence followed the findings. Then came the final detail, one that shifted responsibility from error to negligence. The Infrastructure Risk Committee had not been consulted prior to my termination. No transition assessment, no dependency review, no contingency approval. They eliminated the architect before altering the foundation. That wasn't legacy complexity. That was governance failure, documented in their own system. Once the emails were surfaced, the discussion moved from technical failure to legal exposure. I wasn't in the room, but I received a summary from someone who understood the weight of the language being used. Legal had reviewed the timeline termination, structural modification, removal of the incremental backup layer, cascading failure, and their assessment was blunt. Dismissing the primary holder of institutional knowledge during a material infrastructure transition could be interpreted as negligent governance. Not a mistake, not bad luck, negligence. Nathan reportedly pushed back. She was replaceable. He said. The phrase echoed louder this time, stripped of the earlier confidence. Replaceable was a theory. The outage had become evidence. Legal asked whether a formal risk review had been conducted prior to my termination. The answer was no. They asked whether a dependency impact assessment had been completed before altering routing logic. Again. No. The board stopped smiling. What had begun as a technical glitch was now framed as oversight failure. Compliance officers began mapping potential disclosure obligations if transaction integrity had been compromised. Regulators would expect transparency if customers experienced material impact. Contractual penalties might apply. Meanwhile, the market reacted faster than any committee. News of instability spread beyond internal channels. The stock dipped, not dramatically at first, but enough to trigger automated alerts. Analysts requested clarification. Institutional investors sent inquiries demanding a written explanation of the outage and the governance process surrounding recent executive decisions. Nathan's earlier language about agility and efficiency began to look reckless in contrast to documented warnings. In legal terms, the exposure wasn't just financial, it was fiduciary. The board had a duty of care. Removing a senior architect during an active infrastructure transformation without review suggested that duty had not been exercised properly. By late afternoon, the board scheduled an emergency session. The stated purpose was operational stability. The real agenda was accountability. For the first time since I walked out of that conference room, the risk wasn't limited to servers or transaction queues. It had shifted to something far more fragile: executive credibility. By the time the emergency board session concluded, the tone inside the company had changed from defensive to surgical. Nathan tried to hold his ground. In an internal broadcast, he assured employees that everything was under control and that the instability was being methodically addressed. His voice carried the same rehearsed steadiness I'd heard in the conference room days earlier. But this time, it sounded thinner, stretched over facts that no longer cooperated. The audit presentation followed. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Slide after slide reconstructed the timeline with clinical precision. My upgrade proposals had been submitted and rejected. My dependency warnings had been acknowledged and dismissed. The decision to terminate my role had been approved without a formal risk review. The routing configuration had been altered. The incremental backup layer had been removed. The infrastructure had destabilized. There was no commentary, just sequence. One director reportedly asked a single question. At what point was the Infrastructure Risk Committee consulted? The answer was simple. It wasn't. Shortly afterward, the board voted to place Nathan on administrative suspension pending further investigation. The language was measured executive oversight failure, procedural lapse, operational governance review, corporate phrases designed to sound neutral while signaling consequence. An internal email went out to senior leadership confirming that mismanagement of infrastructure transition protocols was under formal examination. I received a forwarded copy within minutes. I read it once. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. There was no satisfaction in watching someone unravel under the weight of their own shortcuts. The outage still needed resolution. Employees were still fielding angry calls. Stability mattered more than vindication. Then another message arrived, this one from Enterprise Sales. Our largest client had issued a conditional statement. They would continue the partnership only if I joined in an advisory capacity to oversee infrastructure stabilization and governance reform, not the company. Me. Cold justice doesn't shout, it documents. It concludes, and it reassigns authority without theatrics. For the first time since being labeled non-essential, the system had spoken clearly, and this time, the board was listening. When the formal advisory contract arrived, I didn't sign immediately. I read every clause, every limitation, every reporting line. Then I sent revisions. If I was returning, it would not be as a quiet fixer. I signed as an independent infrastructure advisor, not an employee. My conditions were explicit. I would not report to Nathan or anyone from his transformation team. I would receive unrestricted access to system logs, configuration histories, and incident reports. A newly formed oversight committee comprised of board members, compliance officers, and external auditors would review every structural change before execution. For 21 years, I absorbed risk quietly. This time, governance would be documented. When I walked back into the building, the energy had shifted. Engineers looked relieved. Executives looked cautious. No one used the word non-essential. The war room screens displayed transaction flow, error rates, and replication lag. I didn't bark orders. I asked for data. We reconstructed the dependency bridge that had been removed, restored configuration layers from partial archives, and staged validation tests before touching live routing. Every adjustment was logged, reviewed, and approved in writing. I wasn't there out of anger. Anger is loud and inefficient. I was there because unstable infrastructure doesn't punish executives. It punishes customers, payroll, and employees who had nothing to do with the decision. Stabilizing the system was an obligation to the people who depended on it. But the difference this time was structural. I set the pace. I defined the review checkpoints. I required written acknowledgement of every risk trade-off. The same executives who once waved away my caution now asked for my assessment before speaking. Control does not require volume. A week later, the independent audit report was finalized. It quantified direct outage losses, contractual penalties, recovery expenses, and market impact. The total exposure reached well into the tens of millions of dollars. The report concluded that the so-called optimization initiative, specifically the removal of redundancy layers without transition review, was the primary catalyst. No dramatic language, no blame theatrics, just numbers. This time, the cost of agility had a decimal point and a signature attached to it. The final report was delivered without ceremony. It arrived as a formal document. 73 pages of findings, timelines, and financial impact assessments. No speculation, no dramatic conclusions, just structured analysis. I read it slowly, aware that this was the moment where narrative gave way to record. The investigation concluded that Nathan's termination of my role, combined with structural configuration changes, constituted negligent oversight and a failure to assess infrastructure risk. The language was precise. It stated clearly dismissal of critical institutional knowledge without transition review materially increased operational exposure. There it was in writing. My name appeared throughout the appendix, not as a hero, not as a victim, but as the architect who had issued documented warnings. 3 dependency alerts, 2 upgrade proposals, 1 memo outlining routing risks, each attached with timestamps and acknowledgement receipts. Documentation had outlived opinion. Nathan attempted one final defense. He argued that transformation required bold decisions, that no system could be fully insulated from complexity, that leadership sometimes demanded difficult trade-offs. It was the same vocabulary he had used when labeling me overhead. This time, no one echoed him. The board voted to terminate his contract effective immediately. The announcement was brief and procedural. Failure to adhere to governance protocols during infrastructure transition. That was the official phrasing. No raised voices, no spectacle, just consequence. When I received confirmation, I felt something unexpected, not triumph, not relief. It was steadier than that. The system had corrected itself, not because of outrage, but because of record. Later that afternoon, I was invited to a private meeting with the board. The conversation was measured. They acknowledged the need for structural reform, stronger oversight, and executive literacy in technical risk. Then the chair looked at me and said they would like to formally offer me the role of Chief Technology Officer. Not advisor, not consultant. CTO. The position Nathan once held influence over would now report through me, for a moment. I considered the symmetry. They had called me non-essential. Now they were asking me to define what essential meant. When the board formally offered me the CTO position, I didn't answer right away. The room was quiet, expectant. It would have been easy to say yes. The symmetry was tempting. But leadership isn't about replacing one name on an office door with another. It's about fixing what made that door dangerous in the first place. I appreciate the trust, I said, steady and clear. But I won't take the role full-time. A few brows lifted. No one should be indispensable. I continued, but no one should be dismissed as disposable. That was the difference. I agreed instead to remain in a strategic oversight capacity, with authority to redesign the governance structure around infrastructure decisions. We rebuilt the architecture not just technically, but organizationally. Critical systems were mapped with shared documentation. Cross-training was mandatory, and every major configuration change required formal risk assessment and committee review. Terminating key personnel during structural transitions now triggered automatic oversight protocols. Redundancy was no longer treated as inefficiency. Experience was no longer labeled overhead. We reduced dependency on any single individual, including me, but we institutionalized respect for accumulated knowledge. Documentation became active practice, not archived theory. Risk evaluation became procedure, not suggestion. Months later, stability metrics returned to their previous benchmarks. Clients regained confidence. Employees regained sleep. I never asked for an apology. I didn't need one. They called me non-essential. The infrastructure disagreed. The most powerful moment in this story wasn't the suspension, the audit, or even the offer of a bigger title. It was the decision to stay calm when I was dismissed, to document instead of argue, and to insist on governance instead of rushing back to quietly fix what ego had broken. That choice protected more than my pride. It protected the people who depended on the system. What I learned is practical, not poetic. Experience has value, but only if it's recorded. Warnings matter, but only if they're documented. And integrity means setting boundaries even when you could easily be the hero in the room. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't retaliate. I let process speak. When facts are clear and records are intact, accountability has a way of finding its target. If you were in my position after years of loyalty, labeled non-essential, what would you have done? Would you have run back and solved the crisis to prove your worth? Or would you have required structure, oversight, and respect before stepping in again? Those decisions aren't dramatic in the moment, but they define how you see yourself later. Where are you listening from today? Drop your city in the comments. Someone reading your response might realize they're not the only one navigating a workplace that underestimates them. If this story resonated, consider subscribing One subscription helps this message reach someone who needs to hear that documentation. Boundaries and steady leadership matter. A like or a share might help someone rethink how they handle their next difficult meeting. You're not just supporting a channel. You're helping spread the idea that calm accountability can change outcomes and that standing firm, without rage or revenge, is sometimes the strongest move of all. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.